Hello and welcome to Scottish Forestry and the Outdoor Woodland Learning funded recorded webinar of Swings and Things. My name is Kate Hookham and I'll be presenting this webinar. I've been working outside with children for over 25 years, both as a teacher and informally, and now as a consultant. So why on earth would we want to set up and create with children swings? And I've said and things, that means ladders and bridges and various different bits and pieces, hammocks, that we'll be looking at during this webinar. So first of all, it meets physiological needs, and I really like Maslow's theory from 1943, where he mentions the hierarchy of need, and the baseline of that is to meet physiological needs. So shelter, fresh air, as it says below there as well, enough food and enough water, and also enough sleep. So once we've met our physiological needs, we then want to also, next up, feel safe. And so involving children in risk assessing and helping them to make their own judgments is great for a wide range of things such as resilience and understanding, keeping themselves safe rather than you always monitoring that situation. All these things are also massively going to help with their physical development, probably more so gross motor skills, but equally fine motor skills and dexterity, especially if you involve them in the lashing and hitches and knots that we'll be looking at in this webinar. That's going to build on their intellectual knowledge, and often these activities and experiences require a lot of problem solving and higher order thinking skills. So we become more analytical, we synthesize our understanding from a previous experience, we start to evaluate how well things have gone. And that equally links strongly in terms of higher order with creativity and children being creative about how they're making these balance beams and various other pieces of equipment, obviously with you overseeing and making sure these creations are safe enough. Equally, don't tend to do this very much on our own, tends to be social. We often like to push each other on the swing or take part in these activities as a group. And it builds on our emotional resilience, our ability to trust others, and our response and self-regulation of our own emotions and experiences and reactions to situations. So huge emotional potential and confidence building when we set things up correctly for children to succeed. And finally, tons of curriculum being covered. Not only science, technology, engineering and mathematics, but vocabulary, functional language, health and well-being because they're risk assessing, and equally visual arts and social sciences as well. So a range of curriculum areas, experiences and outcomes can be covered when we work together to create swings and things. Just want to mention some relevant laws in this webinar. I'm sure there's other things that might come into what you're doing. It depends what you're creating, where you're going, the age group you're working with, etc. But very much health and safety at work for ourselves as the adults involved, and that has implications for the children. Occupiers Liability Act relates to the sites that you're going to, or if it's school grounds. Compensation Act puts in place a stronger momentum to not have a blame culture, and this act very much encourages you to allow the benefits to try to outweigh the risks and taking account of the benefits, and therefore trying to find ways to give children these experiences. And obviously Relevance Disability Discrimination Act, and working with children with specific needs to also enable them to have experiences on swings and things. Equally, I just want to refer to this legislation, and this very much, actually, these two link to playground environments. And I've been on site when people have come to inspect, and often in the woods, they don't want to measure things, they don't want to check things because it's classed as a wild space. So these standards are specific to playground environments, so we don't need to go, thank goodness, and put lots of soft play surfacing, impact surfacing around about in the woods, but we do need to be aware of the height that we're setting things up for the age and stage, and what's underneath, what's underground. So risk assessment is all about balancing. For me, I now do benefit risk assessment, and that's about balancing the benefits with the risks. And if the benefits outweigh the risks, I try to find a way to achieve that experience or that goal. And there's various factors or categories that we might be exploring when we're risk assessing. The first is the environment we're going to. Secondly, the resources we use or the resources we find. The experience level of the participants, both adults and children, but also the experience we're giving to children, the individuals and their specific needs and abilities, developmental milestones, etc., and the group dynamics and the group experience. So all of these come into play when you're risk assessing. For me, pieces of paper don't tend to keep children safe, but 3 vital questions do. So I will often, when I'm about to create a swing or a ladder, I'll talk to the children about what's good about doing this, and they'll come up with the benefits because we're doing benefit risk assessment. And then we say, well, what do we need to be careful? And most children talk in the end result, the risk, the thing that's going to happen to them, rather than the thing with potential to cause harm, which is the hazard. So most children will say, I might slip because it's wet, rather than the hazard being weather. They might say, I might fall, rather than the height. But you'll get a combination of both hazards and risks, and you can note those down, obviously, in your documentation. And finally, well, how do we stay safe? And when we see how do we stay safe, children come up with amazing precautions. We then agree on the appropriate precautions, and that's what we do for the day. And from my experience, most children like to tell tales on other people. They see things quicker than we do sometimes. And so it's just a really good way to make everyone aware of what's out there and how we're all going to keep each other safe. Very short bit on the hazards, but I really would like you to be dynamically risk assessing in the site, in the location, with the resources, all those factors that I talked about. So environment, resource, experience, individual and group. But hazards that you might be coming across in this webinar when you're creating these experiences for children are the rope that you're using or the string you're using, how high you're going to be when you're setting things up, the surface below where you're doing this, the structure that you're using to support the experience, be it a tree or a shrub branch, what's over the top of that and things that might fall, the tools that you might need to engage and use, biohazards, that's flora and fauna that could be hazardous to children and staff, the weather conditions, obviously, and the people that are involved, children and adults. And from those hazards, you will be coming up with benefits and risks and precautions. So let's move on to specifically thinking about the factors that are involved in throwing up swings and things. First of all, you're probably out in the woods going to be using a tree as a base, as a solid fixed point. So the first thing to look for is the right tree species. In Scotland, probably the best tree species that commonly come across would be sycamore, oak and beech, although beech can snap and break, especially mature beech trees in high winds, so please be aware of that. But they usually have nice, solid, strong branches like this oak tree here that you could throw a rope over. Equally, the next 4, when they're mature and large and nice and healthy, they can also be good solid base points. But I would definitely avoid anything with quite flexible limbs, such as spruce and a lot of the coniferous trees, birch and willow. When you're finding a tree, if you set a swing up, for example, sometimes over time that will become, the ground will become scuffed, and that might start to affect the tree roots and the ecosystem, the micro ecosystem around. So just be aware and preferably rotate where you're putting your swings up, and don't have a permanent point, especially if you're getting really compacted ground. That can be a hazard in itself. And equally, if you're out searching, please try to avoid the really prominent trees that might have some conservation order on them. So we've talked a little bit about species, but equally any tree, be checking and looking for signs. And if you're deeply concerned, you might be able to get a tree surgeon or someone with more knowledge to come with you. Think about how mature that tree is and the strength of it, the health of it. And also the area around the base and near to the trunk in terms of the swing zone and the surface area. A healthy tree tends to avoid those items there. So you don't tend to get a lot of cracks in a branch, don't have bulges, which might be an indication of fungus. You won't have any splits, hopefully. If you knock it, won't be hollow. Won't be having any evidence of dead wood or hanging branches around. So avoid all of that if you're looking for a branch to put up perhaps a swing. And also be aware of the lever effect, that if you have a really long rope and a long swing, there's going to be greater load put on it when you get to the pivot points. Linked to that, a good rule of thumb in terms of height that you set things up is that these experiences should not be higher than the height of the child's head. This is also useful language to use with the children, as most children are quite aware roughly how tall they are, and so reminding them not to climb higher than when they're standing on the ground, how high their head is. So measure that against the tree and the branches before they start climbing and stop at that point. If you're concerned that children can't assess that, then I often use thick red ribbon and I tie that where I want the children to stop climbing, so when their hand reaches that point, they know they need to stop. Not only height, but also the area in which they might fall is an important area to consider. So make sure there's at least sort of 2.5 meters, around about 6 feet across from the center point of where you're placing your swing or your ladder, etc. So we've now looked at the location you might be fixing some of these, highly likely to be a tree. Now let's explore the cordage, the ropes, highly likely to be using string in these circumstances that you might be using to construct these experiences with. So for these purposes, it's likely you'd be going one of 3 ways, in my opinion. Firstly, you might be using some braided, plaited material. Could be natural, or for a bit of strength and knowing exactly what's involved, synthetic fibres are quite good. They usually have a weight-bearing load associated with them if you check or ask, and there's various websites that talk about that. So perhaps something like a boat mooring line that's about 20 mil thick would start you off. Or you might go for webbing, the thin flat material that you often get in climbing walls on the self belays, or in DIY locations to fix tarp down on lorries and things like that. Or finally, synthetic ropes. I often like to use a climbing rope. Could be an abseil rope, which is quite static, or you might get more dynamic climbing ropes. Bear in mind the stretch that can occur if you're going to use a climbing rope for this. But equally, when you're swinging, it's not got such a juddering experience because there's a little bit of stretch as you go. So again, pros and cons to these things, but make sure you get a decent thickness to make sure it will bear the load of the experience you're thinking about giving the children. And tying the right hitch or not is also important, like the timber hitch on the right hand side. So there's lots of information online about ropes and string and cordage. General rule of thumb, most climbing ropes will have quite a high breaking strain, and that is often related to how heavy the rope is, the length and the thickness of that rope. If you're interested, more information on that website. And the life of a climbing rope is very much depending on how often you're using and what you're using it for. If you're actually using it for climbing, or if you're using it for some play experience with children, probably best to replace after a couple of years in that sort of circumstance. But again, very much depends on regularity. But there's lots of advice on a range of websites about that, as is the break point and the strength of a range of nylon cordage. There's a website there that you can check that information out. So we really want to think about if that rope, string, cordage is fit for purpose. And these are things to consider. Firstly, if you want a stretchy rope, some dynamic rope for your purpose, or if you want it to be relatively low stretch and therefore static. You want to be thinking about the wear and how regularly you're going to use it. If it is worn, and checking that it's not damaged in any way. The breaking strength of that material, as we mentioned in the previous slide. Perhaps environmental credentials. So obviously natural materials a bit better than synthetic materials. But again, if you use that synthetic material for its full life, it's quite worth that investment, in my opinion, and especially for safety reasons in this situation and these webinars. Texture, again, climbing rope tends to have a lower, it's quite smooth rope, whereas polyprop and a few natural materials can cause friction burns quite easily if children run their hands along them. So you might want to bear that in mind. If you're carrying it a long way, weight is important, and obviously your budget, as many of these items, especially climbing rope, is quite expensive. Once you've got your cordage and rope, it's very important to store it correctly. Then it will last you much longer. So storing it in a dry location, making sure it's out of sunlight's not so good, it can degrade. So keeping it in a dark storage container of some sort where it's dry. Always coiling your rope before you put it away, and if it's become dirty, put it in a wash or put it in the bath with some baby shampoo and sugar it about, and then dry it flat on the floor, zigzagging it to dry out, especially climbing rope. And when you're putting your rope away and you're coiling it up, feel and look for any damage. If there's frayed ends, such as on the right hand side, you want to deal with that rapidly, otherwise it will just get worse. So you might heat seal that, or do a bit of common whipping around it to stop it fraying. Bit of duct tape perhaps. So we've got our rope and we've got our tree. Then we need to get our rope over our tree, which can sometimes be fun and interesting. So there's a few different ways in which we can do this. Firstly, we might want to coil up about 1/3 to half of the rope. Put a few hitches around the central point of that, and use the weight of that rope to throw, overhand throw usually best, over the tree branch, and then let that come down and untangle it. Or you may, especially if children are away from you, fix a small stick around it for a bit of extra weight, making sure that stick is secure. Alternatively, sometimes it's hard to throw a big climber rope. So you might want to get some string or some paracord in this case, and throw that lightweight string in a ball, or perhaps again wrap around the stick over the tree, and then making sure you've attached the string to a rope before you do so, perhaps with a sheet bend there. The sheet bend, very useful to connect two different sized ropes, so I'll often use a sheet bend for this purpose. And again, online, type in sheep bend, you'll find some information about how to tie those. And then basically you throw your string over, pull, 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 pulls your rope over the top, and down it comes. You untie your string and away you go. So this next slide is quite a busy slide, but I wanted to put the entire procedure that I tend to follow on one slide. So I apologise, there's a lot of text, but I'm just going to go through this briefly. So when I'm putting anything up, a swing, a ladder, a balance area, either I would construct it or I would help in that construction with the children, involving the children. Depends on the situation and what we're trying to achieve. I need it to be safe, but there are many ways in which you can engage children in this activity. I've got the children there, then I always do a benefit risk assessment and ask those 3 vital questions about what we're about to do and how we're going to stay safe. We very much emphasize all the time that ropes are not to be wrapped around any part of a person's body. We only wrap them around trees and branches, material we find on the ground. Sticking to that idea that we want to be at head height, so maximum at 2 meters off the ground. We want the level of activity and the challenge that children are setting themselves to be appropriate for their experience level, their competence, and not their confidence, because some children are incredibly confident, but perhaps not that competent in keeping themselves safe. So we need to monitor that and point things out to those children. All equipment should be fit for purpose and what you're trying to achieve, checking the surfaces thoroughly, making sure any hard or protruding material, where possible, can be removed, or pointing those things out to children. Maybe having to relocate your site if you find something that you feel is not safe enough. In general, it's nice to have a flat surface, but sometimes we have a bit of a slope for added fun and enjoyment, again, for you to risk assess. Always test it yourself when you've put it up, that it'll take your weight, because usually if it takes your weight, it will take the children's weight. And equally, do not assist the child in climbing up or down. If they can't get up themselves, they don't have the gross and fine motor skills to be able to keep themselves safe. So they need to be able to do those things for themselves. And finally, encouraging children to self-regulate, share, be safe, with obviously you overseeing from the appropriate distance. Now, this is my insurance. I've just cut and paste, so that's why it's so tiny. You don't need to read the small print, but what I want you to do is make sure that you have the appropriate insurance cover for what you're doing, and you're allowed to do what you're planning on taking part in. Some insurances list things, and this is why I chose Burn Bank, because they actually listed what I am insured to do. Other people's insurance is a bit more vague, but perhaps check and review your insurance and the permissions you have on those insurance policies. So we've found our tree, we've got our rope material, and now we want to tie and construct these experiences for children. To do that, we'll probably use a range of knots, hitches, bends, and lashes. And when we're creating these things, we often use the terminology on this slide. So when I'm talking about tying hitches, etc., and in the little videos, if you click on those to see them, I'll often be mentioning the working end, which is the end we're using at the time, and the standing end, that's the bit that we're not using. And when we're tying things, we will often create loops, or some people say a turn, where there's a complete twist in the rope and it crosses over, and a bite, which is basically you take a section of rope and bend it over on itself, not crossing over. So for the purposes of what we're doing in this webinar, I feel these hitches and knots and bends are useful. There are many out there, so you might want to be using other things, but for me, this is what I tend to use when I'm making these physical creations with children. I might use a lark's foot if the branch is low level, I can reach it, or if I'm going to put up a permanent structure, for example, swing, because it's quite hard to undo a lark's foot if it's high up out of reach. You'll need to climb up there or get a ladder or something. But a simple hitch, very secure, keeps the rope in place. And again, click on that link and you'll be seeing how to do that. Timber hitch, very strong, often used when I put up a hammock. Strong in one direction, loosens off very quickly in the other direction. So always keep tension on your timber hitch, but I'll often be using that when I put hammocks up, and there is a link to see how to do that in detail on the left there, or you can follow those pictures on the right hand side. Basically, make a little eyelet, twist it round, pull it tight in one direction, and that's you. Equally, we might need to make our rope longer or connect our rope to another rope. Perhaps if we're throwing it over a tree, it's not quite long enough. We need to attach one rope to another. Fisherman's bend, probably the best bend when you're using two ropes or pieces of string of similar size, but quite an easy one to do with the children and for them to learn two overhands on the separate bits of string and then pull the other sides and it slides together. Also useful for making bracelets and necklaces and loops of varying sizes. So that's the link to find that one. As I've just mentioned, getting ropes and string over trees, we could use a sheet bend. Very much chosen if we have two ropes or pieces of string of differing sizes. You can do a single one or the double there at the end. So basically you make a bite with one, you thread it underneath, over the top, round the back, and then weave it through and pull it tight. That's your sheet bend. Figure of eight, for a range of purposes, this is the only knot I tend to tie because knots are hard to undo once I had a load put on them. But a figure eight is multifunctional, so I do enjoy this one. It's also really obvious if you've tied a figure of eight correctly or not. So in this photo, that's just a stopper knot, so just one figure of eight on a line, nice chunky knot to thread things onto and stop them falling off the end. You might do a figure of eight on a bite to make a loop that does not change in size. You might be rethreading your figure of eight around a post or a tree, or sometimes when we're climbing we would use this on a harness, so it's not going to come undone from around an object. Or we use a slippery figure eight to be able to undo it very quickly, but again tie something off. Just make sure the end is not loose, because if that gets jerked or pulled, it'll come undone. There's a link to see how to do all of those variations. So I feel those knots and hitches and bends are probably the ones you would use to be creating these things we're about to talk about here. So one of the things you might think about doing is making your own trim trail. Obviously low level, following your insurance and guidance and various other pieces of legislation that we need to follow. But we might make our own trim trail by finding things as we go on our walk and not have to move or change anything in any way, like this young lady walking along a fallen tree trunk. So we might find our balance beams, we might find log slices to create stepping stones with, or we might then be adding extra elements to our trim trail. So we might make mini bridges, balance beams, ladders, swings, etc. to be part of that. Now to accompany that, you might want to look into slack lines. Best one for children are Gibbon slack lines. There's a link there. Some people take a bouldering mat with them if they're worried, but obviously if they don't fall on the mat, that's not going to save them. So we'll come on to that a little bit later on. So making your own. Here's a link to a simple, I call it a balance line. So it's a bit of webbing on the bottom there. Because we work in early years, you might want to have two handholds either side that they can hold on to. Or you might just want one that they lean against, because sometimes just balancing on a bit of webbing, or in brackets tightrope, is quite hard. Please make sure it's not too high, preferably about knee level when you're doing this. There's the link there. Or we might be putting up a hammock. Now we can get our pre-designed hammocks, as in these two photos here, and there's a link on how to put up a pre-designed hammock. You can add a shelter in if you want to, especially if you were with me on the shelters webinar. That's a A-frame shelter there over the top of your hammock. But again, tips on putting up a pre-designed hammock can be found on that link. Alternatively, you can try and make your own hammock, and that's quite good fun with the children. So you want a really solid piece of material that's not going to rip and break easily. So I probably wouldn't use a duvet. This is a bit of old Gore-Tex sheeting, but mid-weight tarp is also great for this. So you'd find the shortest side if it's rectangular, and gather that together and put an object underneath it. In the top left photograph there, you can see some objects you might use. So I'll sometimes use tennis balls or squash balls, or take a stick with me or a stone. So you place your object underneath, you put your clove hitch over the top. So middle photo, middle top, objects underneath there. I think that's a ball. Clove hitch around the top of that. Because that object is in place, it won't slip off when you tie up your clove hitch to your tree or structure. Gather all that material together, do the same on the other side, test it by an adult, and you have your own homemade hammock. We might also fancy making a ladder. So there's two different styles of ladder we could go for. This is a solid timber ladder, so you need quite a bit of wood for this. I would recommend using freshly cut green wood if possible as well, not dead wood. Dead wood, very hard to tell the break point on dead wood, and it might snap quite easily under weight. So some fresh wood is often best. This bit of sycamore. And then I would use a ladder lash for that. Now, every time you use the ladder, make sure those knots and hitches are all still thoroughly in place and have not loosened off. If you need to tension them, please do. Quite involved, that one, but there's a video on how to do it on the left hand side there. Basically involving clove hitches, half hitches, and overlash. So yeah, a few different knots involved in that creation, but good and solid. Or just for a bit of fun and extra wobble in our lives, it's lovely to make a rope ladder. Again, we just need a few green woods for our steps, and then the fantastic marlin spike hitch, super strong. Slot those over each side of your stick, have your loop at the top, and you've got yourself a nice rope ladder. There's a link there in how to do it. Swings. So two styles of swing, most common. You can have a single attachment, so with one line, one rope, often with a hole drilled through what's going to be your seat, or lashed around it perhaps. I prefer a drilling effect if we've just got the one item. Now, the benefit of this, or the disadvantage of this, depending on what you're thinking, is there's a huge range of movement, and you can go in any direction from your central point. So being aware of that, and watching out for that seating flying around, so risk assessing with the children. An alternative to the single point attachment is a double point attachment, usually on either side of what we're using for a seat. This tends to have a lot more control and directional movement, i.e. forwards and backwards. So something to be aware of if you don't want a sort of 360-degree movement and you just want a forwards, backwards, you might think to put up a double attachment rather than a single. There's a YouTube video there to see how to throw up a swing like this. I would just obviously put a caveat on that this is part of the video, and I would frap those ropes a little bit more if I was leaving it up all day. Once we've picked the location, the tree or the structure we're going to use as the fixed point, the rope or material we're going to use, and created our experience for the children, it's really important that we review how we're going to keep safe, so how we're going to protect and prevent falls and injury. For me, the key thing is training children, showing children how to bend their knees and jump off of things, land safely. Really talking a lot about how we use our hands and what a good grip is. 3 points of contact is always top. So 2 feet, 1 hand, 1 hand, 2 feet. And alongside that training, regularly and getting the children to check the surfaces below them, the canopy and things above their heads and what's around or near them in their swing zone. Perhaps you may wish to have a bouldering mat, but the problem with that is it doesn't cover a huge area. Children are more inclined to be lackadaisical, relaxed, and throw themselves off. They might miss the mat. So for me, training and checks are key. All of the little films that you've seen in this webinar are available on this playlist for Scottish Forestry. And here are the references, my contact details, email and website if you wish to get hold of me for further information. 2 key documents I feel that are useful for webinars such as this on swings and things, and a range of websites to give you advice, talk about resources, and OWL itself, obviously. Many thanks to Scottish Forestry and OWL for funding this project and this webinar. I hope to see you all maybe out in the woods sometime enjoying your swings and things. Many thanks. Bye for now.